Welcome to today's podcast series, Wise Tech for Wise Money. Our focus today will be on clean energy, tax credits, and the AI revolution reshaping financial compliance. I'm Gary Wayne at A1 Solutions. We work with AI to improve financial operations, drawing on experience from working with various firms in the financial sector. Today, I'm joined by Neil Winward from Dakota Ridge Capital, who specializes in clean energy. Today's discussion will examine the concrete impact of artificial intelligence in financial advisory services. Neil will present his perspectives from Dakota Ridge regarding how AI may enhance business growth and ensure regulatory compliance. By the conclusion of this episode, we hope listeners will have a well-defined framework for incorporating AI into their own professional practices. Hi, Neil. It's good to have you here. Could you provide us with a background to your role and history at Dakota and your journey into clean energy?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Gary. Good to be on the podcast. And sure, this has been a long journey. I've been in financial services for well over 35 years, and most of that time has been with either merchant banks or large banks. I've run structured finance groups globally, and there came a point, I think, during the financial crisis when structured finance, as was defined at that point in time, which was large institutions using cross-border structures to suck as much money as possible out of their respective fiscal authorities, became not flavor of the day. AIG Financial Products and Barclays Capital kind of really summed up everything that the market did not like about that business. And that business mostly migrated into the accounting and legal professions, providing bespoke solutions to their clients. And then the rest of the, should we call it, tax mitigation business moved into renewable energy. And it moved into renewable energy because there were lots of incentives that were offered by various governments to encourage people to make investments in the renewable energy sector. The narrative of climate change and the urgency around that was what catalyzed that. And so most of the leasing industry, the structured finance industry, went into renewable energy, and structures were developed to enable people to partner up with developers. Developers of projects typically do not have the tax base that they need to absorb these incentives. And so they need to partner up with, particularly in the US, there are various other countries that incentivize those investments in different ways. But in the US, which is my primary market, the way that the government chose to incentivize this was to essentially offer tax credits and depreciation benefits for investing in these projects. So if you made an investment of 100, you could write it off over a short period of time. You made an investment of 100 and there was a tax credit of 30 associated with it, you could claim that tax credit against your taxes. Obviously, that meant that you needed to have a tax base to claim that credit against. And if you didn't, it wasn't very useful. So structures developed where financial institutions and large taxpayers who are sophisticated in investing in the financial sector would enter into partnerships together whereby the party with the tax base would take the majority of the tax benefits until they ran out, and the developer would take the majority of the cash benefits. And that was all structured around the tax investor, or as they were called, tax equity investor, achieving a target return, after which they would exit the investment. They would be bought out by the developer, and the developer would continue to operate the project for the cash revenues that came from it. So that was the basic template for investing in renewable energy in the US. So that was a part of the business I ran when I was at Dresdner Kleinwort, and various partnership structures were developed in the mid 2000s and have continued ever since. I started my own business in 2009 with a partner from Dresdner, and we continued to arrange financing in that sector. That business was sold in 2012 to KKR, and I continued at that time with a couple of partners to advise banks largely around the tax investments that they had done. Around about 2018, I joined Oryx, which is a Japanese-owned financial conglomerate, to help them build a tax equity business, to use their tax capacity and their investment appetite to invest in wind, solar, anaerobic digesters, or waste to value. And we built that business substantially over a 5-year period, investing in all of the various technologies that I mentioned. The interesting part of that is those investments are subject to legislative control. Essentially, if you are going to take benefits from the government, you are subject to changes in legislation impacting the investment profile. So at that time, we'd made an investment in a very large anaerobic digestion facility. And anaerobic digestion is simply you take the cattle waste that comes off dairy farms and you cook it in you sort of cook it for a period of time to turn that methane that would otherwise emit into the atmosphere into a higher grade methane, a more refined 98% pure methane, which was then injected into a pipeline sent to California and used by various fleet vehicles as compressed natural gas. So we made a $7 million investment in that project. And in between that project starting and it being completed, the Inflation Reduction Act came about. And the Inflation Reduction Act essentially made that project's entire capital structure eligible for an investment tax credit. So the investment that we had made at $7 million immediately increased to around $35 million, which wasn't a bad thing at all. It came back very quickly through estimated taxes. But I think the shock to Oryx of seeing what legislative impact could take place on the investment that they made caused them to want to exit the business. So since that period of time, I've been pursuing the business through my own company, Dakota Ridge Capital. I work with investors in and developers of renewable clean energy projects to help them monetize the benefits that are available to them. So that sort of brings us up to today.
Is this a global market or particular to the US?
Well, it is a global market. I mean, ironically, the largest consumer of fossil fuel is China. The largest consumer of renewable energy through solar, both as a manufacturer and as a user, is also China. And there are all sorts of different incentives that the government creates for that industry, largely similar incentives to the ones that they create for their entire manufacturing base. But China, India, Europe, I mean, you'll have been aware of the moment that Spain had earlier this year when its entire grid went down for a period of time. I mean, the investment in renewable energy over the last 30 years has been extraordinary. So it is a global industry, and it's different jurisdictions incentivize industry, the private sector, to invest in renewable energy in different ways. The way that I just described is specific to the US, and the structures around that have developed within the unique investment and tax framework that the US has developed.
Well, with all these regulations, etc., how do you find the compliance challenges?
Well, compliance is, as you know, a really big feature of the government's oversight of the financial services sector. And because because the financial services sector is massively incentivized to invest in the energy sector, governments have correctly understood that without energy power, there is no power. I think you're finding that in the UK at the moment with Mr. Miliband's policies. But the price that you pay for taking incentives from the government is you have to demonstrate compliance with the rules and the regulations that they set out for you to benefit from those incentives. So, the tax incentives are set out in legislation and in case law, and each investor in and developer of those resources that are going to benefit from those incentives needs to pay very careful attention to whether or not they are complying with the tax guidelines that are set out. So they need to take accounting advice, they need to take advice from tax lawyers to make sure that they are staying within the parameters set out. I'll give you an example. I use the word just now, tax equity, where investors will get involved with developers and they are there primarily for the tax. But the way the US tax code is set out, in order for them to benefit from those tax incentives, they need to have what the government defines as equity. And equity is, an ownership position. So even though the reality is that those investments are structured much more like debt than equity, they need to meet the guidelines set out to define what they're doing as equity as opposed to debt. So that's one example. I think another example is if you, and this is really in sharp focus after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, and then the modifications to it that were generated by the One Big Beautiful Bill. There are two kinds of incentives. One based on investment, which is an investment tax credit. So the amount of capital, it defines how much benefit that you get. And the other is a production tax credit. So you get a benefit based on every unit of energy that you produce. So if the goal of the legislation is to incentivize the generation of clean energy as defined, then you have to demonstrate that, in fact, you are producing clean energy. So you have things like carbon intensity scores, which are measured in a certain way, and you have concepts such as life cycle analysis to measure those benefits. So life cycle analysis in the context of let's say a dairy farm would be, what is the acreage that you're starting with in terms of, the amount of cattle waste that you're producing, how much cattle waste is coming in, what is it gets as detailed as how many trucks per day are being used to truck the cattle waste from the dairy farm to the place where it's being processed. Each of those steps in the process has a carbon intensity score. And so as you measure those factors across the life cycle generation, you measure the capability of the technology that's being used to produce a certain grade of methane, for example. And those steps in the process all need to be measured and then measured against the benchmarks that have been set out to establish the credentials of the credit that then attaches to it. So there's a ton of steps that are needed. And so the steps can get even more complex when you have a solar farm or a wind farm, let's say, and it goes into operation, generates, as well as the electricity it generates that it puts into the grid, it generates something called renewable energy certificates, which are evidence that you've been operating a clean energy facility. And those renewable energy certificates are tradable. And every time one of those certificates is retired or taken out of circulation, that's a good thing. It's sort of like the concept of carbon credits. You can either
Sure.
generate clean energy or you can generate unclean energy, a traditional energy, and buy credits to credential you as having done the thing that the authorities want you to do. So really, it means that you have spent money to buy those credits, and that capital has flowed to the people who have generated the clean energy and given them the capital to build more projects and so on. So the market in carbon credits, in renewable energy certificates, is an important part of the compliance infrastructure that has been set up around these.
How does your team manage all these verification processes and all the documentation that must go with this?
Well, it won't surprise you to know that businesses have emerged that do exactly that, that will go into companies and check the equipment, check the processes, establish a set of procedures that are agreed upon by by the Department of Energy to meet the needs of the conditions that are set out. So it's accounting firms, it's advisory firms, specialized consulting businesses that do that. Another example is there are additional incentives available for the use of domestic content steel in the manufacture of the solar panels and inverters and so on, and the wind farms and so on. And the domestic content is something that needs to be carefully scrutinized. So what happens is the advisory businesses that establish compliance will go into the supply chains of the developer to make sure that the people that they're sourcing the content from are indeed themselves sourcing the content from the right places. And invoices will need to be presented, examined, and then documentation records kept to show that that process has been gone through and is compliant. There are additional incentives that were set up for the benefit of labor unions. So to make sure that the procurement and the construction was using labor that was paying a certain wage, that there was a certain percentage of the hours that were put into the project construction that was using apprentices. So, that entire infrastructure, as you can imagine, is massive. It's not something that I can or pretend to do. My job really is to work with developers to connect them with the right resources so that they can comply. And if I'm working with an investor, to make sure that the investor is investing in something where that compliance has been properly complied with and documented and so on. So it's a massive task, and there are entire businesses whose business purpose is to make sure compliance is established.
Do you outsource all your compliance, or do you do it internally?
No, I outsource that. I don't have the resources to be.
The costs
Um,
must be phenomenal.
no, no, it's a huge, very, very labor intensive. I mean, a lot of it can be desktop, right? But the simple process of going into a supply chain, I mean, we see this now with companies trying to calculate tariff levels, right? You have to go into a uh, a multi-step analysis of a complex global supply chain and check out what comes from where. And so that's a really labor-intensive task that I'm not set up to do.
What about other companies? I mean, how are they coping? On the same basis, or are they using technology more and more to deal with these processes
Yeah,
internally?
that's a great point. I mean, the the opportunities that exist to use AI to simplify this process are huge, right? I mean, it's like a fascinating web that is developing. We're using AI to simplify a lot of the steps in our work processes. And of course, in order for that AI to run, which is about 10x a regular Google search, in order for that AI to run, it needs a lot of energy, and the data that's generated needs to be stored. Excuse me, the data centers that are needed to store that data need to be built. They themselves run on an enormous amount of electricity, and so the supply of that electricity is a massive task. So that the whole process is interconnected, and it's dragging us up this really steep curve of energy usage, which is requiring more energy. And it also requires something that we haven't invested in enough for many, many years, which is grid infrastructure. It's sort of an ironic feature of the renewable energy business that wind and solar and hydro provide a lot of energy. They're scalable, but they don't stabilize the grid. because the wind turbine only works when the wind's blowing, the solar farm when the sun's shining. And so
Sure.
they don't create grid resilience. They're not base load power. And adding batteries to it isn't the answer because batteries are enormously expensive, relatively speaking, at the scale that you would need to add them in order for them to make those intermittent resources capable of providing a baseload function. I mean, think about it. If the sun shines 8 hours a day, you would need 3 times the amount of solar farms to be running and to have 2 of them filling up batteries at the same time the third was generating power, which is consumed by the
A
grid.
vicious circle.
So it's just it's a massive task. So that's why we see the increased focus on nuclear. The reality is we're still running our energy infrastructure globally on 86% fossil fuels. So that's just a reality that isn't going to change anytime soon. So I think can you use AI for enhanced compliance? I'm sure you can, because it's a task that really is very well suited to that. I mean, it's really looking across patterns in the trading sense, looking across trading patterns and seeing if there's anything that gives concern. That's really tough for a human to do with the same level of efficiency. Running searches across supply chains to establish compliance with, with rules and regulations is something that AI is well suited for.
How do you see AI?
No, how do I see AI? I mean, it's going to really make this task an easier one to complete, but I think there's a little bit of a Jevons paradox that goes on here. It says, well, if we have AI, then it will make it easier. Therefore, the amount of time devoted to doing it will go down. I don't think that's going to be true. I think the more we see the capabilities of AI to make our work processes more efficient and simpler, the more we're going to use it. And the more we're going to move on to other things that will also find that AI can be used to enhance the processes and so on. So I think it's just going to grow and grow. And I'm not actually sure how we're going to provide and source all of the energy we're going to need to do that.
Do you see it as a tool also for, apart from compliance and risk, which we just discussed, for marketing in clean energy? Is it something that could be used for that? Or do you get your clients by referral, etc.?
I think social media is a huge part of marketing. There's no two ways about it. We have these various platforms. I mean, you connected with me through LinkedIn. You found me on LinkedIn. Obviously, I'm aware that capability exists. So I post content on LinkedIn. I put my profile on LinkedIn. I keep it up to date and so on and so forth. There are other platforms, Substack, X, Instagram. All of these are really serving the purpose of connecting people who might have the ability to collaborate. And so I think we're all dancing to the tune that the algorithms are dictating to some degree, right? So LinkedIn decides that it wants to move its algorithm in a certain direction in order to maximize the amount of time that its subscribers spend on the platform. And so we have to figure that out. If we want people to see what we're up to what we can see what we can do, see how we could collaborate, we have to understand that. And we use various tools to do it. So AI is just another extremely useful tool to generate content, to pass content, to help us keep abreast of content that we need to be aware of. It's once upon a time, if I had a question about, let's say, what does the one big beautiful bill say about the various incentives available for producing hydrogen energy that's going to benefit from a particular credit, right? I would have to download a copy of the bill, sit down with it, go through it, go through the code, the regs, or most likely call a tax attorney to get their opinion. Now you can do a series of searches on your favorite AI tool, and within a matter of minutes, you can get all of the detail that you need. Then you have to check it, of course. But that process is incredibly powerful, incredibly useful, and makes my job a lot easier. It doesn't mean that we don't need the resources that we used to use. It doesn't put tax attorneys out of business because there's a lot of soft skill that goes into interpreting the simple facts that you find, right? But it means that you can get to the point quicker. You can get to the essence of what you need to be doing a lot quicker. So it's super useful in that regard.
Well, do you have any concerns about the implementing of AI into your workflows in your company?
Yeah, I worry about the hallucinations that go on. I've definitely fact checked. I always fact check the information that gets fed back to me. And I would say, probably 10% or more of the time, I'll find errors. I'll say, wait a second, that isn't right. You need to go check this. And they'll be like, oh, yeah, you're right. Thanks for pointing that out. I'm like, wait a second, you're my AI tool. Supposed to know this stuff. So that's a concern. Um, I think another concern is, I just got an invitation from Perplexity to use their Comet tool to manage my workflows, my inbox, my calendar. And as I sit down and I look at what it is that they want me to do, it's really inviting in an unknown agent to your most personal of
Sure.
processes and saying, yeah, go for it. Yeah. It's like, when you had once upon a time, I remember when I came to this country, we were in Dallas, we had an office immediately prior to us going there, the office manager that had been running the office, and office managers had a tendency to take over a lot of processes for executives, but a lot of picking up dry cleaning, buying birthday presents, this, that, or the other. This particular office manager had also helped herself to the bank accounts of a couple of the executives and so on and so forth. It's not a new story, but the the agentic AI assistant that we're being enticed to use presumably can have the same capabilities. So I do worry about auditing the security level associated with that kind of
But there
assistance.
are things you can put in place to stop that. I actually posted on my LinkedIn the other day, and it wasn't my origination, a post that one of the guys I'm talking to sent me, whereby there was an elaborate scam put in place where people were raising money via a private Swiss bank, and the Swiss bank was raising money for this so-called scheme, and it turned out to be an AI deepfake. But there are systems, obviously, and he put it on his post, that can prevent, checks and make sure these things don't happen. So yeah, AI can be dangerous in, like you're saying, regarding perplexity, but there are things you can put in when you implement it to prevent that happening. Are you, moving towards AI? Are you preparing your team for technology changes, or are you sort of behind the curve, or are you on the curve? What do you think about it at the moment
No,
in where
I'd
you
say
are?
I'm pretty close to all in, not completely all in. I am, and if I look over the last year at the number of times I use Google or Safari, for example, versus the AI tool that I use, it's probably 1% of the usage that I had a year ago. And it's become such a big part of what I do every day that if I sit and reflect on that, it's a huge change. And so it just feels normal now. Maybe a year ago it felt novel. Now it's just an expectation. It's like, okay, I have, let's say, 10 newsletters that I'm interested in and want to read, but I didn't have time to read them. So I'll take those newsletters and I'll put them into my OTL. Please summarize, the key sort of 10 points from this newsletter today. And I'll just attach that document, put it into ChatGPT and read the summary. That way I can get through, the process. That's just one example
Well,
of
where do you
many.
see opportunities in this space in clean energy over the next 12, 18 months?
Think some of the fuels that have been de-emphasized or not sufficiently emphasized in the past. Hydrogen would be a great example of that. I think we're going to see increasing numbers of clean hydrogen facilities coming to market and generating energy. I think that's going to happen. And then, you go downstream from that to different products that come off that, ammonia and, is it hydrogen gas or liquid hydrogen? What are you using it for, etc. I think that's going to be an opportunity. I think that the incentivized development of nuclear is going to increase, and I think it's going to be small modular reactors are going to become, more. We're going to see more of those just because they take a shorter period of time to come to market. And the issue is not whether or not you want nuclear power, you do, but the problem is that we've developed a regulatory infrastructure around that, which has been based around 3 Mile Island type fear. And that's been dispelled to a large degree, but the regulatory infrastructure still exists. And the current administration is taking big strides to sweep that away, and which is an important step that needs to happen. I think we're going to see more natural gas powered generators being brought into the energy mix. I think we're going to see more hardening of grid infrastructure, electric grid infrastructure, as well as pipeline infrastructure. Those things are going to happen, and this administration is completely focused on that. The energy secretary, the secretary of the interior, the EPA, is all focused on doing that. So I think that's going to be a huge part of the energy landscape in the US.
So this administration is going to make you a lot busier.
It's really a strange thing because I started off heavily emphasizing renewable energy in my marketing materials. I pivoted towards clean energy just because, the reality is that renewable energy is not resonating with the ethos of this administration, right? It's considered to be the Green New Scam, quote,
Oh.
quote. The reality is that the quickest way to provide more energy on the grid is by scaling solar, for example, because they can be put in place relatively quickly. But the incentives have changed. And so the Inflation Reduction Act was a massive shot in the arm to the renewable energy business on the face of it, making people like me a lot busier. But when people talk about, and there was a great relief about it being a 10-year landscape and people plan and so on, just like we've talked about making the tax cuts permanent in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Well, any legislation is only as permanent as the support for that legislation continues. So you just need a sufficient majority in each of the, in Congress, the House, and in the, in the White House to change any piece of legislation, right? So there isn't anything like a permanent piece of legislation. Some things are harder to get rid of than others. Some things are harder to put in place than others. But when the changes to the IRA were being discussed, that created uncertainty. So there was a period from, Inauguration Day through the 4th of July when there was considerable uncertainty about the future of the renewable energy business. And uncertainty is really bad because it freezes people's investments. Investment committees say wait and see. Manufacturers don't know how to plan their investments. Developers are frozen or have to make assumptions and hope. So the certainty that's created by legislation being passed is very, very helpful. At least you know which direction to go in, where to focus your efforts. But you're absolutely right. The focus on energy that this administration has is enormously helpful to developing the energy resources that we need because we have to grow, right? There is no choice. And if we want to grow as an economy, we need energy. We can't grow without energy. It just simply doesn't work. And the other thing that, we are going to need to do is and that this change in focus is beginning to happen. We need more welders. We need more electricians. We need more skilled tradespeople and more plumbers and so on, which haven't been a feature of the educational incentives for,
No, in the
the
Western world, in
yeah.
fact, everything
Right. It's just
was
not.
about being at a desk.
Yeah. And so where are those resources now? They're approaching retirement. Where are the resources that we need to step into those shoes? They're in 8th grade. And so, that's going to be incredibly, obviously, robots can be developed to a much greater degree. China has done an amazing job of developing its robot infrastructure, largely helped ironically by Apple moving its manufacturing there and teaching them how to do this. So we need to do that. And I think we will do that. And so those are the opportunities I see.
When you think about, things, the way they're progressing technology-wise around the world, and all the regulations and all the compliance and all the issues that keep getting put on our laps from the SEC, etc., FCA, what sort of worries you and what keeps you up at night, if anything?
What keeps me up at night? I think what keeps me up at night is that we won't do what we need to do to generate the energy that we need to do what we need to do. I think we are moving forward on the assumption that everything that we need to accomplish the economic goals that we have set out will be in place, but those things are not all in place. You can see, for example, that in order to build the factories and onshore the manufacturing that this administration aspires to, we need a lot of stuff. We don't just need the people to build and construct the stuff. We need the stuff itself. We need the raw materials. And a lot of those raw materials come from a global competitor, China, who knows very well the leverage that it has. We're starting to figure it out. The government's made an investment recently in a company called MP Materials, which produces rare earths. Unfortunately, the majority of rare earths in the world exist in and are exported from China. We need those rare earths to actually operate our military. And Marco Rubio is on record as saying, well, there are a lot of wars that won't, a lot of conflicts that we won't be able to participate in and help with because we don't have the materials that we need to build the missiles and the aircraft and the, and the naval resources that we need to enforce that presence. That's just a
That's
reality.
scary.
And so I do have a concern that we are operating on the assumption that we have all the cards in the US to be able to do what we need to do. And, we're 50% of the global market cap in the stock market, which is kind of crazy. But is that because of our lead in innovation, or is it just because we have that lead, but it's eroding and it won't be that in the future? So I think there are some great directions that are being established by the current administration, but we're not solid and secure on that path yet. So I do worry that the execution is going to be a lot more difficult than talking about it, right? It's one thing to say, we have this great deal with Japan, we have this great deal with Europe. Those deals have to be implemented, and implementation isn't so glamorous. And so I do worry about the execution and whether we're going to be able to accomplish the ambitious goals that we set out in the time frame that politically is required, because next year we go into midterms. There may be a change in the political
Sure.
power structure at that point, and that may derail some of these directions that have been set forth.
Okay, well, Neil, that's great. In conclusion, I mean, what advice would you give firms who are just starting out in clean energy investments? Anything special to say, or from an experienced man such as yourself?
Look, I think you have to find the right niche for you. It's not. I've worked with some folks who honestly have somewhat jumped on a bandwagon as they perceived it to be. That bandwagon has been dismantled as they were riding it, and so they've fallen off it largely. But I think you have to figure out where the landscape incentives are, what your skills are, where you can use those skills to secure the necessary, land, permits, offtake arrangements. What do you know? What are you good at? Where are your connections? Where are your skills? Who can you partner up with to get things built and get them to market and get them properly configured? It's not easy just to, wake up one day and say, I'd love to develop this. That is really hard. So I think figuring out who you are, what your skills are, and where you are in the ocean, whether you're a minnow or a shark, and if you're a minnow, where you're going to find protection, where you're going to partner up with people who can protect you against the larger predators out there. That's really, it's a challenge. Being an entrepreneur is an incredible challenge. Whichever area you're being an entrepreneur in, whether it's what I do, what you do, whether
Sure.
it building a solar farm, a wind farm, whatever it is, it's super hard. So you have to think very carefully, plan, and understand everything you need to know before you start committing time and capital to it.
All right, Neil. Well, thanks very much. I think that covers everything.